The community center was bustling with activity that afternoon. Tables were arranged neatly, chairs pushed into rows, and the smell of fresh flowers mixed with the faint aroma of coffee and pastries. It was one of those small-town events where everyone seemed to know everyone, and the chatter of friends catching up filled the air. Volunteers were running around, making sure the program would run smoothly, and a few latecomers trickled in through the doors, still carrying their coats and bags in the corner of the hall. Almost unnoticed, an elderly nun stood quietly near the piano. She was dressed in her simple habit, the kind that had been worn for decades. Her hands were folded calmly in front of her, and her eyes seemed to watch the room with a gentle curiosity. Most people didn't pay her much attention at first. In a room filled with bustling energy and lively conversations, an elderly nun standing quietly didn't seem like someone who would be the center of attention. The organizers, a group of busy people who had spent weeks planning the event, were looking for a way to open the program. Someone suggested, half-jokingly, "Why don't we ask Sister to play a piece? Something simple for a prayer, maybe?" A few others laughed lightly. "She? Really? I don't think she plays much beyond hymns." Their tone was not mean-spirited, but filled with a hint of skepticism. After all, the nun was elderly, her hands looked delicate and frail, and she moved slowly. To them, this seemed more like a polite gesture than a real performance. When the suggestion reached her, the nun simply nodded. She didn't say much, only smiling softly. Her quiet acceptance was different from the rest of the room's chatter. It had a calmness that seemed to pause the chaos for a moment. She didn't insist, she didn't argue, she just walked toward the piano at the side of the room, moving slowly but with a surprising steadiness for someone her age. A few attendees noticed her movement and whispered among themselves, "She looks so old. I wonder if she can even reach the keys properly. Do you think she actually plays?" The comments were not meant to be cruel, just curious, but there was an unspoken doubt in everyone's voice. It was the kind of doubt people carry when they underestimate someone at first glance. Without knowing their history or their abilities, the room slowly began to quiet as the nun sat down on the piano bench. She adjusted her habit, folding the sleeves neatly, and rested her hands lightly on her lap for a moment before placing them on the keys. The piano itself was modest, a little worn with years of use, but it had a warmth to its sound that reminded people of older, simpler times. The audience, now sensing that the program was about to begin, shifted in their seats. Some leaned back comfortably, ready for a polite little melody, while others watched with a hint of amusement. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The hall, which had been buzzing just moments ago, was filled with a quiet anticipation. Even the volunteers, who were used to running around and managing the crowd, paused for an instant. There was something in the way the nun sat, the way her eyes closed gently as if she were taking a deep breath, that suggested she was preparing for more than just a simple tune. Then she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out, soft and clear, filling the hall with a sound that seemed to float in the air. It was delicate, but it carried a weight, a presence that was hard to explain. The people who had been skeptical leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the unexpected beauty of the sound. It wasn't flashy or loud, it didn't need to be. It was the kind of music that made you stop breathing for a moment, the kind that makes you listen carefully to every note. As she played the second note, then the third, a quiet murmur spread through the room. People exchanged glances, surprised. The music was gentle at first, almost like a whisper, but it had a depth that suggested something more profound. Some attendees instinctively closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. It felt like the piano was speaking, telling a story that words could never fully capture. Even the volunteers, who had seen many performances over the years, felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The room was no longer just a place for a small community event. It had become a space where people were noticing things they didn't expect. Hearts were softening, and an unspoken respect for the elderly nun was growing. She wasn't just playing a simple prayer piece, she was sharing something personal, something that came from deep within her life of faith, experience, and devotion. The children, who had been restless moments ago, paused mid-whisper. watching her small hands move across the keys. Even the teenagers, who often scrolled through their phones during events like this, lowered their devices and looked up. There was a quiet magic in the air, subtle but undeniable. Every note seemed to carry a memory, a prayer, a lifetime of quiet dedication. Some people began to remember the stories they had heard about her, how she had spent decades serving in the community, caring for the sick, comforting the lonely, and offering guidance to anyone who needed it. How she had learned music in her youth and continued to play every day, even when no one was listening. And now, sitting in the middle of a crowded hall, she was giving everyone a glimpse of that hidden talent. A talent that had grown quietly over the years, unnoticed and underestimated. As the melody continued, the skepticism that had filled the room at the start began to fade. People who had whispered jokes moments ago were now completely silent, caught up in the emotion of the music. The notes rose and fell like gentle waves, sometimes tender, sometimes strong, but always full of feeling. It was impossible not to be moved by the sincerity of her playing. Even those who had initially doubted her talent began to feel a sense of awe. How could someone so unassuming, so quiet, have such control over the piano? How could the touch of her fingers create a sound that made hearts ache with beauty? They realized that appearances had fooled them. The elderly nun, who seemed fragile and timid at first glance, was capable of something extraordinary. The room, once filled with casual chatter and small jokes, was now completely transformed. Every person, from the youngest child to the oldest attendee, was drawn into the music. Some sat with their hands folded, eyes closed as if in prayer. Others leaned forward, trying to catch every nuance of the melody. There was a shared experience happening, a quiet understanding that something special was unfolding before them when she finally lifted her hands from the keys. A few seconds of stunned silence followed. People blinked, as if waking from a dream. Then, slowly, applause began to build. At first, it was hesitant, but it grew louder and louder, filling the room with warmth and appreciation. The elderly nun smiled softly, her eyes shining with humility. She had not played to impress anyone, nor to seek recognition. She had played from her heart, offering her gift as a prayer. And the room had received it in a way she had never expected. People began to come forward, shaking her hand, expressing their surprise and admiration. Some whispered apologies for doubting her, while others simply hugged her, overwhelmed by emotion. The volunteers, who had organized countless events, admitted quietly that they had never experienced anything quite like this. Even the skeptics had to acknowledge that the music had moved them in ways words could not explain. By the end of the performance, the elderly nun returned to her seat at the side of the hall, quietly watching the reactions around her. She didn't seek attention or praise, but it was clear that she had made a lasting impact. The room had changed. People had learned a lesson they would not forget. Never underestimate someone based on appearance alone. And never assume that simple gestures cannot carry extraordinary meaning. Her music had done more than fill the room with beautiful sound. It had touched hearts, opened minds, and reminded everyone present of the power of patience, dedication, and quiet talent. In that small community center, an elderly nun had shown that true gifts often reside where they are least expected, and that a humble act offered sincerely can create moments that people will carry with them for a lifetime. As the attendees slowly left, still talking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, the memory of the first notes lingered in the air. They would not remember the jokes or the skepticism that had come before. They would remember the music, the grace of her hands, and the way an ordinary afternoon had been transformed into something extraordinary. And the elderly nun, with her quiet smile and gentle eyes, returned to her simple life, carrying with her the knowledge that a single performance played from the heart had moved an entire room of people who had once mocked her, and now would never forget the power of her music. After the performance, the room was still buzzing, but in a very different way. The laughter and chatter that had once filled the air had been replaced by soft conversations, murmurs of awe and quiet admiration. People were still trying to process what they had just witnessed, The elderly nun, who had moved gracefully away from the piano, now sat in a corner, her hands folded on her lap, a small, serene smile on her face. She didn't seek attention, but somehow everyone's eyes kept returning to her. Some of the younger volunteers whispered to each other, barely able to believe what they had seen. "I thought she would just play a few notes and be done," one of them admitted. "I didn't expect that." His voice trailed off, unable to find the right words. Others nodded, their eyes wide, thinking the same thing. The skill, the depth, the emotion, it had been unlike anything they had expected from someone so quiet, so unassuming. Meanwhile, a few of the more skeptical attendees were slowly approaching her, curiosity overcoming their doubt. One older gentleman cleared his throat nervously and said, "Sister, that was... well, I didn't know you could play like that." The nun looked at him, her smile warm and gentle, and replied softly, "Music is a prayer, and every prayer has its own voice. I'm just glad it spoke to your heart." Her words were simple, yet carried a weight that made even the skeptical man pause. Across the room, children who had been fidgeting during the start of the program were now sitting still, some even wide-eyed, amazed by the music they had heard. One little girl whispered to her mother, "Mom?" It sounded like the piano was telling a story. Her mother nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Yes, dear. And it's a story that comes from the heart." The simplicity of the statement seemed to capture exactly what everyone was feeling. The music wasn't about technique alone. It was about life, experience, and emotion. And the nun had poured all of that into her performance. The atmosphere had changed entirely. People who had come expecting a small, polite prayer song were now sharing an unspoken understanding. This was not just music. This was a message, a connection, and a reminder of the beauty that can exist even in quiet, simple lives. Some began to discuss quietly among themselves, sharing their impressions. One woman said, "I feel like she was telling us about her life without words, all through the piano." Another added, "It's amazing how someone so gentle can create something so powerful." Even the organizers, who were used to planning events where everything ran perfectly, stood quietly for a moment. They realized that this performance had shifted the focus of the entire afternoon. What they had thought would be a small, polite gesture had turned into the highlight of the event, something no one would forget. One of them whispered to another, "We almost didn't ask her. Can you believe it?" The other nodded silently, still shaken by the memory of those first notes. As the initial applause and excitement began to settle, some attendees approached the piano to examine it more closely. They ran their hands over the worn keys, noticing the small dents and scratches from years of use. They realized that the piano had a story of its own, much like the nun who had played it. Each mark on the keys seemed to hold a memory, a note once struck, a song once shared. It was a simple instrument, but in the hands of someone with experience and dedication, it had become a tool capable of extraordinary emotion. The nun, meanwhile, remained calm and composed. She didn't boast, she didn't explain, and she didn't seek recognition. She simply accepted the reactions with a quiet grace, as if what she had done was natural, even ordinary. But those who watched closely could see the subtle signs of emotion in her eyes. For her, playing the piano had always been a form of expression, a way to communicate when words fell short. Seeing the audience moved in such a profound way was both humbling and rewarding. A few moments later, the program speaker approached the stage, noticing the lingering energy in the room. "Before we continue," he said, "I think we owe a special thank you to our performer." He gestured toward the nun, and the room erupted in applause once again. This time, it was deeper, more heartfelt, filled with genuine admiration. People clapped not just for the music, but for the years of dedication, for the life she had lived quietly, and for the humility she had carried all along God as she returned to her seat. Some people approached her individually, expressing their awe. A man in his 50s, who had been skeptical at first, said, "I don't know how to describe it. Your music. It touched something inside me I didn't even know was there." The nun looked at him and said softly, "That is the gift of music. It doesn't need explanation. It speaks for itself." Another young woman with tears in her eyes whispered, "I've never felt anything like that before." "Thank you for sharing your gift." The nun nodded, a gentle warmth radiating from her presence, making everyone around her feel seen and understood. Even the children, who often have short attention spans and little patience for formal events, were captivated. They kept returning to the piano, watching the nun's hands rest gently on the keys, imagining the stories they had told. One boy whispered to his friend, "I want to learn to play like that when I grow up." His friend nodded enthusiastically. "Me too. It's like magic." Their innocent admiration reflected exactly what everyone else was feeling. This was something beyond skill. It was pure expression, something magical born from a lifetime of devotion. Throughout the room, a quiet transformation was taking place. People were no longer focused on themselves, their schedules, or even the small details of the event. Their attention had shifted entirely to the power of what they had witnessed. They were realizing, slowly but surely, that true talent doesn't always announce itself loudly. It often arrives quietly, patiently, and unexpectedly, leaving those who witness it forever changed. The elderly nun, sensing the shift in energy, continued to sit calmly, her presence a grounding force amid the newfound awe. She didn't need to speak to command respect. It came naturally. People felt it in the sincerity of her eyes, in the gentle way she held herself, and in the undeniable truth of the music she had shared. The room was no longer just a community center. It had become a place where hearts were opening, barriers were dissolving, and people were seeing the world, if only for a moment, a little differently. Some of the volunteers, inspired by what had happened, began to discuss how they could honor her contribution. "We should ask her to play again," one suggested. "Maybe at the next event," another added, "or we could record it, so more people can feel what we just experienced." But the nun, overhearing these suggestions, simply shook her head gently. She didn't need recognition or fame. For her, the act of playing, of sharing her gift honestly and openly, was reward enough. The reactions of the people, the change in the room, the subtle way hearts had been touched, this was all the acknowledgement she needed. As the event continued, conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People referenced the performance again and again, recalling specific moments where the music had caught their breath or made their hearts ache. Some compared it to hearing a voice speak a truth that couldn't be put into words. Others reflected on how often they overlooked the quiet, unassuming individuals in their own lives, realizing that they, too, might have hidden depths and talents waiting to be discovered. By the end of the afternoon, the elderly nun had become the quiet hero of the event. She had arrived unnoticed, underestimated, and almost forgotten in the bustle of preparation. Yet through a simple, heartfelt act, sitting at the piano and sharing her music, she had transformed the entire gathering. She had shown that true talent, humility, and dedication can create moments that resonate far beyond their initial context. People left the community center that day carrying not just memories of an event, but a lesson. Never judge someone by appearances, never underestimate a quiet life, and never forget the power of sharing a gift sincerely. Even as she returned to her daily routine later that evening, the nun carried a quiet satisfaction. She didn't need applause or recognition, but she knew the music had touched hearts. And in a small, profound way, she had reminded everyone present that the most extraordinary things often come from the most unexpected places. That afternoon, an elderly nun, underestimated and overlooked, had shown a room full of people the true meaning of devotion, talent, and the quiet power of a prayer played on a piano. As the evening moved forward, the memory of the piano performance refused to fade. Even as food was served and small conversations restarted, people kept drifting back to the same topic. The music had settled into their hearts in a quiet but powerful way. Some smiled as they remembered the first note. Others felt a soft ache inside, the kind that comes when something touches a deep place in the soul. The elderly nun sat quietly near a window, watching the light change as the sun slowly dipped lower in the sky. A soft orange glow fell across the room, and dust in the air shimmered like tiny stars. She did not speak much. She never forced conversation. But people kept coming to her one by one, almost as if they were drawn by something they couldn't explain. One woman sat beside her after standing nearby for several minutes, unsure of what to say. Finally, she spoke in a soft voice. "I don't know why, but when you played the piano, it felt like you were telling my story." The nun looked at her with gentle eyes and replied quietly, "Music listens to people. It reaches places we cannot reach with words." The woman nodded slowly, wiping her eyes, feeling understood without having said much at all. Across the hall, a group of men who had joked earlier now stood silent, their earlier words heavy in their minds. One of them finally said, "I feel ashamed." I laughed at the idea of her playing. Another replied, "So did I, but what she played, it changed something in me." They fell quiet again, realizing how quickly they had judged. How wrong they had been. The organizers whispered together again, this time with respect instead of doubt. They spoke about how the performance had shifted the entire event. There was no rush anymore, no loud excitement. Everything felt softer, calmer, deeper. People were listening better to each other and to themselves. As the room slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm, a young volunteer approached the nun with a hesitant smile. "May I ask, how long have you been playing?" The nun let out a small, gentle breath before answering. "Since I was very young. The piano was the first place where I felt I could speak freely." The volunteer listened closely, surprised by how simple the answer was, yet how much it seemed to carry. Another person nearby overheard and gently asked, "Did you ever perform before today?" The nun paused for a moment. "Not like this. Mostly alone? Sometimes for prayer, sometimes just for the quiet." Her voice was calm, without sadness or regret. It was clear that she had never felt the need for a stage or an audience. The music had always been something private, something personal. As these small conversations continued quietly, something strange and beautiful happened in the room. People who had come for a regular community event now found themselves reflecting on their own lives. Some thought about dreams they had once set aside. Others thought about talents they had hidden out of fear or doubt. The nun's simple act had unlocked something inside many of them. One older woman sat alone near the back, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes were distant. She had lost someone dear months ago and had been carrying that grief silently. When the piano had played earlier, she felt the music wrap around that pain, not removing it, but softening it. For the first time in weeks, she felt able to breathe again. A man who worked long hours and rarely paused to reflect leaned against a wall, staring at the floor. The tunes echoed in his mind. He remembered his own childhood, the dreams he once had of learning music, of doing something just for the joy of it. Life had become busy. He had become practical. He had forgotten what it felt like to dream quietly. The elderly nun had no idea how many hearts she had touched that day. She had not intended to change anything. She had simply followed a request, placed her hands on the keys, and played what lived inside her. Yet the impact had moved through the room like gentle waves. At one point, a small group gathered near the piano again, staring at it in silence. One of them reached out and pressed a single key softly. The sound echoed briefly through the room. Everyone looked up. The simple note now seemed powerful, almost sacred. It felt different than before, as if the piano itself had changed. The nun noticed this from across the hall and smiled faintly. She understood that the piano was no longer just an object in that room. It had become a reminder, a symbol of something deeper that many of them had just discovered later. When most of the crowd had thinned, a small, unexpected moment unfolded. A young person slowly approached the piano and sat down nervously. Their hands hovered over the keys, trembling. They pressed one note, then another, unsure at first. The sound was uneven but sincere. Everyone quieted instinctively. The nun watched closely but did not interrupt. She could see the fear and the courage mixed in every movement. After a few notes, the young person stopped, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I'm not very good," they whispered. The nun slowly stood up and walked toward the piano. Every step was careful, calm. She placed her hand gently over theirs and said softly, "Being good comes later. Playing from the heart comes first." Then she stepped back. The young person tried again. The notes were still imperfect, but something had shifted inside them. They were no longer afraid. The room remained silent, not out of judgment, but out of support. That small, quiet moment became just as powerful as the earlier performance. It showed everyone that the magic wasn't only in the nun's skill, it was in her spirit, her patience, and her belief in others. By now, the sun had nearly set outside. Evening shadows stretched across the floor. The event had almost ended, but no one seemed eager to leave. People lingered, as if afraid that stepping outside would break the spell that the day had created. Some exchanged phone numbers. Some made quiet promises to themselves. Some simply hugged strangers without knowing why. The nun prepared to leave quietly, not wanting to draw attention again. She slipped her hands into the sleeves of her habit and moved slowly toward the door. But before she could exit, someone noticed and gently called out, "Sister." "Thank you." One voice became many. "Thank you for playing. Thank you for reminding us. Thank you for the peace." She turned back, surprised by the wave of voices. For a moment she did not speak. She only bowed her head slightly. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "The music was never mine alone. It belongs to anyone who listens." The room fell silent again, not out of shock this time, but out of understanding. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she felt no pride, no excitement, no fear. Only quiet fulfillment. What had been meant as a small prayer had become something far greater, touching lives in ways that could not be measured. Behind her, inside the hall, the people remained changed. Some would go home and sit in silence that night, thinking. Some would pick up old dreams they had once buried. Some would treat quiet people differently from now on, and some would simply remember a sound, a gentle piano, an elderly nun, and a moment that taught them never to underestimate the power of something simple and sincere. Days that followed the event felt different for many people who had been there that evening. Life outside the community center returned to its usual pace. Shops opened, traffic moved, work continued, but for those who heard the music that day, something inside them had quietly shifted. People found themselves thinking about the elderly nun at unexpected moments. While washing dishes, while walking home, while sitting alone in silent rooms, the sound of that piano kept returning to their minds. Not loudly, but gently, like a soft echo that refused to fade. One man, who had spent years working nonstop without rest, suddenly found himself standing at a music store window one evening. He did not know why he had stopped. Inside the glass, he saw a small keyboard on display. For a long time, he just stood there. He remembered the music from the community center. He remembered how it had made him feel lighter, even for a moment. For the first time in many years, he walked into the store and asked a simple question. "How much is this?" Across town, the older woman who had lost someone dear sat alone in her room late at night. The grief was still there, but it no longer felt as heavy as before. She placed a small radio beside her bed and let soft music play as she closed her eyes. The piano notes from that evening returned in her memory, and with them came quiet comfort. For the first night in a long time, she slept without tears. The young person who had nervously touched the piano that day could not stop thinking about that moment. The fear they felt when their hands trembled over the keys. The way the nun had gently placed her hand over theirs and spoken without pressure or judgment. Those words stayed with them. Playing from the heart comes first. They borrowed a small keyboard from a neighbor and practiced late into the night, pressing one note at a time, slowly building courage with each sound. Even the volunteers who usually moved quickly from one event to another felt different now. They spoke more kindly to each other. They listened more. They remembered how easily they had doubted someone who turned out to be extraordinary. That lesson stayed with them. It softened their words. It slowed their judgments. Days later, quiet conversations began spreading around the community. People who had attended the event told others about what had happened. They did not describe it as just a performance. They said it felt like something deeper. They said the room had changed. They said hearts had opened, some listened with curiosity, some with doubt. A few smiled politely, unsure what to believe. But the story spread anyway, not loudly, not through excitement, but through sincerity, and the elderly nun, who had been the quiet center of it all, returned to her simple routine as if nothing unusual had happened. She continued waking early in the morning. She continued her prayers. She continued helping quietly wherever she was needed. And every evening, when the building was silent and most had gone to sleep, she still sat at the old piano in the small room where she practiced. The same worn keys, the same gentle light, the same quiet devotion, but something had changed inside her too. Even if she did not speak of it, she had always played alone. The music had always been her private space with faith and silence. That one evening she had allowed others into that space, and now she understood, perhaps for the first time, how far music could travel once it left the hands and entered the hearts of others. One afternoon, while passing through the same community center again, she noticed something that made her pause. The piano was being used not by a performer, not by someone trained, but by two small children sitting side by side, pressing keys carefully, laughing softly when the sounds came out uneven. Their feet barely touched the floor. Their small fingers searched for notes with curiosity rather than fear. Nearby, an older man watched them with quiet interest. He smiled and pointed at the keys as if guiding them gently without touching. The nun stood still for several moments, unseen by them, watching this simple scene unfold. The piano that once sat ignored in a corner had now become a place of learning, of courage, of shared warmth. Later that same week, something unexpected happened. A few members of the community quietly came together and arranged a small gathering. Not a formal event. No banners. No stage. Just a simple evening where people could come, listen, and share. They did not call it a concert. They called it a moment of reflection. They asked the nun if she would play again. At first, she hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of humility. That moment was enough, she said softly. Music should never be forced. But the way they asked was different this time. There was no doubt in their voices. No curiosity mixed with mockery. Only respect. Only gratitude. So she agreed. The second gathering was quiet in a different way than the first. This time nobody laughed. Nobody whispered in doubt. Nobody watched with folded arms and raised eyebrows. They came with open hearts. The room filled slowly. Not all the faces were familiar. Some had come only because they had heard the story. Others had come because they needed something they could not explain. The nun sat at the piano once again. No announcement. No introduction. Only silence, and when she began to play, the sound felt even deeper than before. Not because the notes were stronger, but because the listening was. People did not shift in their seats. They did not whisper. They did not look away. They listened with their whole hearts. Some cried quietly, some closed their eyes, some held hands without speaking, some simply breathed slowly, as if the music was teaching them how. This time, the music was not a surprise. It was a shared understanding, a reminder of what had already been felt once before, and when the final note faded, there was no loud applause, only stillness filled with peace. After that night, small changes continued to grow across the community. The piano was used more often. Music found its way into places it had never been before. People spoke more gently. They judged less quickly. They listened more carefully. And the story of the elderly nun, the mocked request, and the prayer that moved an entire room became a quiet legend. Not the kind that needed proof. Not the kind that needed fame. But the kind that people passed on when they needed hope. And the nun herself remained exactly the same. Humble. Quiet. Devoted. If anyone thanked her, she smiled. If anyone praised her, she bowed her head. If anyone asked her how it felt to change so many hearts, she simply replied, "It was never about me." Yet everyone knew the truth. One simple request, one underestimated moment, one prayer played from the heart, and a whole room. And later, An entire community had changed forever. Time moved forward, but the memory of that day when the elderly nun had played at the piano stayed alive in the hearts of everyone who had been present. People spoke about it quietly, with reverence, often months later, as though recalling something sacred. The story was no longer just about a small community event. It had grown into something much larger, a symbol of hope, humility, and the power of unexpected talent. The community center, which had once been just a hall for gatherings, became a place of inspiration. People would visit not only for events but also to sit quietly, to hear the piano, or simply to feel the energy left behind by that one performance. The piano itself had become a gentle legend in its own right. Children pressed its keys, elders listened, and newcomers were welcomed with the story of how music had once transformed a room. The elderly nun continued her daily life with the same quiet devotion she had always shown. She still woke early, prayed, tended to those who needed help, and walked through the community with humility. Yet, she carried with her a quiet awareness now. She had learned how a single act, offered sincerely and with an open heart, could ripple through the lives of others in ways she could never have imagined. People came to her in small groups or one by one, seeking her guidance. They didn't always ask about music. Sometimes they asked about life, faith, or how to handle moments of doubt. And in each case, she shared the same calm wisdom she had always carried, speaking gently and simply, letting her words resonate like the soft notes of a piano. She never boasted. She never demanded recognition. And yet, everyone left with a sense of peace and clarity that they could not find anywhere else. One day, a group of children gathered around her outside the community center. They were curious about her hands, the same hands that had played the music that moved so many. They asked questions about the piano, about notes, about how it felt to play. The nun smiled softly, letting them explore. She encouraged them to play from their hearts first, to let their feelings guide their fingers. She reminded them that skill could grow, but the honesty of emotion mattered most. The children listened, wide-eyed and silent, taking her words seriously even though they were just children. And in that small act, she planted seeds of inspiration that would one day grow into talent, courage, and empathy. As weeks passed, the story of her performance reached beyond the community itself. Visitors came from neighboring towns, curious to see the piano and hear the tale. People asked the nun if she would play again, but she always answered gently, "The music has already spoken. What matters is how you carry it in your heart." She wanted them to understand that the power of a moment is not in the applause, the attention, or the fame. It is in the way it touches hearts, changes perspectives, and inspires others to act with kindness and courage. Families returned to the community center with young children, eager to share the story. Parents described it as a lesson in humility. Teachers used it as an example of how talent and dedication are often hidden in unexpected places. The story became part of the shared memory of the town, not as gossip or entertainment, but as a gentle, enduring lesson. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a teacher, a reminder of beauty, patience, and quiet strength. Even the people who had mocked her at first, those who had whispered, doubted, or joked now spoke differently. Some approached her personally, quietly apologizing for underestimating her. Others watched from a distance, observing how calm and serene she remained despite the recognition and admiration. They realized that true greatness does not announce itself. It waits, it acts quietly. And when it speaks, it does so in a way that is unforgettable. One evening, the community held another small gathering, not a formal event, but a quiet moment for reflection. The nun was invited again, but this time not to perform. She simply sat among the people, observing. She watched as children played on the piano, as teenagers whispered notes to each other, as adults closed their eyes, listening. The music that day came from many hands, many hearts, and the room felt alive in a new way. It was no longer just her music that inspired, it was the spirit of sharing, of courage, and of allowing one's heart to speak. The elderly nun's life had not changed in outward ways. She still walked slowly, prayed quietly, and helped wherever she could. Yet, she carried a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her simple act, the quiet decision to sit at a piano and play, had created ripples far beyond what she could see. It had given courage to children, hope to the grieving, reflection to the busy, and humility to those who had doubted. The story of that day was told and retold, not as a tale of performance or applause, but as a reminder of what is possible when someone acts with sincerity and dedication. People learn to look closer, listen better, and believe in the unseen abilities that surround them. They realize that a quiet life, a humble heart, and a sincere gift can transform not just a room, but a whole community, even a whole town. And so life continued. The nun continued to live simply, the community continued to gather, and the piano continued to sing softly for anyone who would listen. But something had changed forever. A simple act of music had shown that respect, love, and attention to one another could flourish in the most unexpected ways. In years to come, many people would remember the elderly nun not for her age, not for her appearance, and not even for the technical skill of her hands. They would remember her for the courage she inspired, for the hearts she touched, and for the lesson she offered without ever saying it aloud, that true greatness lives quietly, grows patiently, and reaches far beyond the eyes that first see it. And long after the notes faded from that community center, the lesson remained. Sometimes a simple act, performed sincerely and offered to the world without expectation, can move mountains of doubt, fear, and indifference. It can open hearts, awaken hidden dreams, and remind people of the quiet, enduring power of hope. That the nun continued her life, unchanged in her simplicity, but forever connected to the lives she had touched. And the people who witnessed her music carried it with them like a gentle flame, one that would never go out.